The whip came down across the loaves before it came down across her hands, and Nessa Ardell heard the crust split like something living being opened. She did not scream. Screaming brought a second lash. She had learned that at 17, and she was 22 now, and the lesson had settled into her bones the way frost settles into a wall. So she stood in the wet gray light of Ember Market, with her palm bleeding onto her apron, and watched Garrick Dunmore, captain of the Guild Concord's enforcers, drag the point of his boot through her bread. 9 loaves, rye and barley, dark as riverbank soil, the whole of her morning's work, and the whole of her week's flour. He crushed them one by one. He took his time about it, because the taking of time was the entire point. Unlicensed grain, Dunmore said, loud enough for the whole square. Unstamped, unassayed, unweighed by the conquered. Sold to honest citizens of Kaldemir by a girl with no guild mark, and no husband and no business standing behind a cart. I have a hearth right, Nessa said. 4th generation. It's on the ward roll. Hearth rights are under review. By whom? By the conquered. Dunmore smiled without warmth. He had a wide, weathered face and the yellow eyes of a middling wolf, and he was not a cruel man so much as a paid one, which in Nessa's experience amounted to the same thing at the wrong hour of the morning. You'll want to be quieter, Beggar. You have a brother. That was the lash that landed. She felt it under her ribs, not on her skin. Around her, the market had gone very still. 200 people, wolves and humans both, packed between the fish stalls and the salt sheds, and not one of them moved. They knew what happened to citizens who moved. Old Corwith the tanner looked at his boots. The Fenimore sisters, who had bought bread from Nessa's mother before Nessa was born, looked at the sky. Somewhere near the well a baby cried, and was hushed with a hand. Dunmore ground the last loaf into the mud, and stepped back to admire it. Concord flour is stamped, he announced to the square. Concord flour is safe. Concord flour is 14 coppers the sack and rising, and if that grieves you, take it up with the weather and not with me. He turned back to Nessa. Your cart's forfeit. Come to the grain-hold on the 8th day, and you may buy it back at valuation. The valuation is more than the cart. Then you'd best bake. He laughed at his own joke. And because he laughed, 3 of his men laughed. And because 3 of his men laughed, a handful of frightened citizens laughed, and the sound of it went up over the rooftops of the Ember Quarter like smoke off a house that was still burning. Then they took her cart, and they left. Nessa knelt in the mud. Her hand was bleeding, a clean line across the palm below the thumb where the whip had caught her when she'd thrown herself over the bread. Stupid. She had known it was stupid while she was doing it. But there had been a moment, half a heartbeat, when she'd looked at those 9 loaves and seen not bread, but 11 days of Tobin's medicine, and her body had moved without asking permission. She began to pick up what could be picked up. Not for sale. Never for sale. Not after boots. But the crusts could be dried and ground and stretched into porridge, and the porridge would carry them to the end of the week, and the end of the week was as far as Nessa Ardell had ever been able to see. You'll want to press that. The voice came from the wall behind her. Low, unhurried, roughened by something. Smoke, or thirst, or years. She turned. He sat in the angle where the salt shed met the old ward wall, in the only patch of the square that stayed dry when it rained, which meant he had been there long enough to learn where that patch was. A beggar. Filthy in the particular layered way of a man who has been filthy through several seasons, with a beard grown wild and hair hacked short by somebody's knife, and a cloak that had been good wool once, before it had been anything else. One leg stretched out in front of him, a wooden bowl by his knee, with nothing in it. Press it, he said again, or it'll open every time you need. I know how to bind a hand. I imagine you do. She looked at him a moment longer than she meant to. She could not have said why. There was nothing to see. Half the Ember quarter had a beggar propped against its walls in the 4th year of the grain rise, and the city had learned to look through them the way it looked through weather. But he had watched. That was the thing. 200 people in that square had found somewhere else to put their eyes, and this ruined man in the corner had watched the whole of it without once looking away, and there was something in the steadiness of it that made the back of her neck prickle. Nessa looked down at what she was holding. 2 of the loaves had fallen clear. The crusts were mud-smeared on one face and whole on the other. She turned one over in her hands, feeling the give of it, the warmth almost gone now. Her mother's voice, from a long way off. Bread that is not given is only flour. She broke the loaf in half. She wiped the clean face on the inside of her sleeve, and she crossed the mud and held it out to him. The beggar did not move. "You've had a whip across your hand this morning," he said. "That's not what I asked you. You didn't ask me anything." "Then take it before I change my mind." Something moved behind his eyes. She caught it and couldn't name it. Then he reached out, and Nessa noticed, in the disconnected way the mind notices things it is not ready to think about, that his hand was very steady, and that the nails were broken, but the knuckles were scarred in 4 straight lines, the way a hand scars when it has spent years inside a gauntlet. He took the bread. He held it under his nose a moment, and his eyes closed. "Rye," he said. "Sour started. 3 days on the mother, salted with sea salt and not with rock." He opened his eyes. "And no chalk." Nessa went absolutely still. "Say that again." "No chalk," the beggar said. "No bone flour, no sweep. You'd be the only cart in Kaldemir that can say so, and I expect that's the actual crime, isn't it, girl? Not the stamp." The rain started again, fine as flour dust. "What's your name?" she said. "Sev. That's not a name. That's the start of one. It's what's left of one." He tore the bread and put a piece in his mouth and chewed slowly, the way starving men learn to chew if they mean to stay starving men rather than dead ones. "Yours?" "Nessa Ardell." He stopped chewing. It was only for a moment. A breath, no more. Then he swallowed and nodded and said, "Ardell," in a voice with nothing at all in it, and Nessa, who had spent 5 years reading men across a bread cart, filed the moment away in the place where she kept things she did not yet understand. "8th loaf's yours if you're at this wall tomorrow," she said, standing. "You've no cart. I've an oven. And no flour. I'll find flour." The beggar looked up at her from the dry corner of the world, rain running down the shed roof between them like a curtain of gray thread. "Yes," he said. "I rather think you will." The Ember quarter climbed the eastern hill of Kaldemir in a tangle of soot-black lanes, and Nessa's house was the 4th from the top of Kiln Row. 2 rooms, a hearth that took up most of one wall, and an oven her great-grandmother had built into the chimney breast out of river clay and river stone. It was the oven that made them anything at all. Half the quarter had no fuel. Nessa had a flue that drew like a hunting hound, and a stone floor that held heat for 6 hours after the fire was raked, and so she baked, and the neighbors brought her their own dough on the days they had any, and she baked that too, for a copper or a turnip or nothing. Tobin was at the window when she came in, which meant he'd been at the window since dawn. "You're late," he said, "and you've no cart." "I've no cart." "Dunmore?" "Dunmore." Her brother was 9 years old and built like a bundle of kindling, all elbows and shoulder blades, with their mother's black hair and their mother's stubborn chin, and a cough that had lived in his chest since the winter before last. He climbed down off the sill too fast, which set the cough going, and she stood in the doorway with her ruined apron and listened to it, that wet, tearing, bottomless sound that seemed too large for the body making it, and did not let anything at all show on her face. It passed. It always passed. That was the cruelty of it. "Sit," she said. "I'll do the tea. We've no honey. We've time. Time tastes like a hedge. Then think of it as a hedge that loves you." He laughed, and the laugh set the cough going again, and she turned to the fire so she wouldn't have to watch. Millrot lung, the physicers called it, when they bothered to call it anything. It ran through the low quarters of Kaldemir like water through sand. The coughing children, the gray-faced dockmen, the mill widows on Tanner's Stair, who buried a husband and then a son in the same season. The guild physician said it was damp. The guild physician said it was the smoke of cheap coal. The guild physician said a great many things, and none of them cost the guild a copper. Nessa poured the thyme water and thought, as she thought every single day, about the sack. One sack. 2 winters back, in the bad month after their mother died, when the rye ran out and her starter was dying of hunger in its crock, she had gone to the grain hold and bought a sack of stamped Concord flour on 11 days' credit at 18%. She had baked with it for 9 days. She and Tobin had eaten it. 9 days later, he had started to cough. She had never proved a thing. She had only noticed. She noticed the way bakers notice, with her hands. Concord flour ran too white and too fine, and it drank water strangely, and it left a gray film on the bottom of the trough that no rye she'd ever milled had left. It rose fast and fell faster. It tasted, very faintly, of the smell of a slate roof after rain. And in it, if you spread it thin on a dark board by the window, you could sometimes find them. Tiny black-purple grains among the pale, curved like a cat's claw, no bigger than a mouse's tooth. Her mother had called them silver spur. Her mother had said, "If you ever see these, girl, you burn the sack. You burn the sack and you say nothing to anyone about who sold it to you. And then you burn the sack again." Nessa had asked why say nothing, and Nessa Ardell, who baked bread on Kiln Row and had hands too fine for a baker and knew 4 alphabets she never explained, had said, "Because the last people who said something are in the ground." The oven that night was cold, because there was nothing to put in it. Nessa sat on the hearthstone with a bowl of crust porridge and her bound hand throbbing, and looked at the thing she had looked at every night of her life without seeing it. The bakestone. It sat in the mouth of the oven where it had always sat, a slab of dark gray stone the length of her forearm, and half as wide again, worn dish-smooth in the center by 4 generations of loaves. It had come with her mother. It was the only object in the house that had. Nessa had a memory, unreliable, of being small and being carried in the rain, and a woman's arms around her, and something terribly heavy in a sack banging against her legs at every step. Around its rim, under the black of 100,000 bakings, were marks. She had traced them as a child with a floury finger. Little angular scratches, hundreds of them, running in a band around all 4 edges, too regular for damage and too strange for letters. Her mother had said they were a maker's mark. Her mother had said a great many things. Nessa put her thumb on them now, and felt the small cold bite of the grooves. Then she got up, because there was no use in it, and she banked what fire there was, and she was reaching for the shutter when she heard the boots on Kiln Row. Not one man. 6 or 7, coming up the hill fast, and with them a sound she knew from the wrong end of a bad night, the slap and rattle of a pitch bucket swinging on a hook. "Tobin!" She was already moving. "Tobin, get up! Get your boots!" The first stone went through the shutter. It came in high and struck the chimney breast and burst the crockery jar of her starter. 31 years of her mother's mother's mother, gone across the floor in a white splash. And Nessa heard herself make a sound she had never made before. The Concord's mercy on unlicensed trade. Somebody was laughing out in the lane. "Come out, Baker. Come and see the mercy." She had Tobin by the arm. The back door gave onto a drop of 11 feet into the alley behind, and she was calculating the ankle and the cough and the 9-year-old weight of him when the smell reached her. Pitch poured along the base of her door. They weren't there to frighten her out. They were there to shut her in. Nessa. Tobin's voice was very small. "Under the trough. Now. Face down. Sleeve over your mouth." "Nessa, the door—" She turned. The door of the house on Kiln Row swung inward on its hinges, and framed in it, against the orange wash of a lit pitch line and the black rain beyond, stood the beggar. He filled it. That was the first wrong thing. Slumped against a wall in a market, he had been a bundle of rags. Standing in her doorway, he took the whole of it, shoulder to shoulder, and the rain came off him in a sheet. Behind him, out in the lane, someone was screaming. Not shouting. Screaming. The high, undignified, animal sound of a grown man discovering the exact edge of his own courage. And under it came the wet crack of something that should not have made that sound, and then the noise of 6 or 7 pairs of boots going down Kiln Row a great deal faster than they had come up it. Nessa stood in her ruined kitchen with her brother's arm in her hand. The beggar lifted his head, and the light of her burning doorframe went into his eyes and came back out gold. Not brown, not amber. Gold, molten and depthless and old, the eyes of no beggar and no dockman and no wolf she had ever stood within a mile of, and the air in the room changed the way air changes before a storm breaks over a hill. "Nessa Ardell," said the man who called himself Sev, in a voice that had suddenly stopped pretending. "How long has that stone been in your oven?" The fire on the doorframe went out under 2 buckets of rainwater and Nessa's second-best blanket, and by the time it was out, the beggar had a hand on her chimney and was breathing like a man who had run further than he wanted to admit. "You'll answer me," she said. "I'll answer you when the boy stops shaking." That was, infuriatingly, the correct order of things. Nessa got Tobin out from under the trough and got the thyme water into him, and sat on the floor with his head against her knee until the cough had worn itself down into hiccups, and the hiccups into sleep. It took an hour. The beggar spent the hour with a broken shutter and a knife, and when she looked up, he had rebuilt the frame out of the pieces and wedged it closed with a splint of kindling, and it was better work than the shutter had been before. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Campaign," he said, without turning. "You learned to make a wall out of what a wall used to be." "You've soldiered." "I've been near it." "That's not the same answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She stood up. Her whole body had begun to shake now that there was time for it. "There were 7 men in my lane," she said. "You went out and you came back and you weren't out of breath until afterward. What did you do to them?" "I frightened them." "With what?" The beggar turned around. In the dim of a raked fire, he was only a shape again. The beard, the ruined cloak, the stoop that made him seem smaller than he had been in the doorway. But his eyes caught what light there was, and they were brown. Ordinary, tired, human brown. Nessa's certainty tipped and slid. "You've had a long day," he said. "You saw a fire in a doorway." "I saw gold." "You saw a fire in a doorway." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the broom and started to sweep her mother's starter off the floor, and she said without looking up, "Fine. You're a beggar who frightened 7 men in men's shutters and knows sea salt from rock salt by smelling a crust. Sleep by the oven. It's warm till dawn. If you're a thief, you'll find 1 copper, a dead croc, and a 9-year-old who bites." He made a low sound that might, in a man less ruined, have been a laugh. "Nessa Ardell." "What?" "The marks on your bakestone." He nodded at the oven mouth. "You've never asked anyone to read them." "I've asked 3 people. A scribe on Lantern Street said they were Mason's tallies. A priest said they were decorative. A drunk said they were a curse and asked for 4 coppers. And you paid him. He'd have got it out of me eventually." This time it was definitely a laugh, brief and rusted. "They're not a curse," the beggar said. "They're old Hallow, the hard hand, the kind they cut into stone when they wanted it to outlast the men who wrote it. That band across the front rim is a date run. Autumn quarter. And those..." He leaned and touched the corner with one broken-nailed finger. Those are weights. Bushels in, bushels out, and a mark beside each for the assay. Somebody carved a full year of grain accounts into the edge of that stone. Nessa stopped sweeping. That's an oven stone, she said. That's a baking stone. My great-grandmother's. It's certainly been baked on. For 4 generations. Yes. The beggar sat back on his heels, and something in his voice had gone very careful, the way a man's voice goes when he is stepping across ice, and does not want the person beside him to notice he is choosing his steps. Which is a remarkable place to keep a thing, if what you wanted was for nobody in the world to look at it twice. The Ember Quarter woke early because it had nothing to sleep for, and by the 7th bell, there were 14 people on Kiln Row, looking at the black scorch up Nessa Ardell's door. They did not commiserate. Commiseration was for quarters where sympathy was still cheap. What they did instead was better. Corwith the tanner sent his boy up with a hinge. The Fenimore sisters brought a crock and a fistful of dried apple, and did not mention the starter. Widow Hesper Column, who was 80 and had buried a husband and 2 sons out of the tanner's stair mills, came up the hill with a jar of her own mother in it, a gray, sour, ferocious rye starter that had been alive since before the grain rise, and put it on Nessa's table and said, "Feed it, or I'll haunt you. Hesper, feed it." The old woman looked past her at the man asleep by the oven, and her eyes narrowed to slits. "And who is that?" "A beggar." He put out the fire." Said Hesper Column, and went closer, and stood over him with her stick, and looked at him for a very long time with her head on one side like a bird deciding about a worm. He woke without moving. Nessa saw it happen, the change in the breathing, the eyes coming open already alert, and it was another thing that went into the drawer of things she did not yet understand. "Morning," he said. "You've a charm at your throat," said Hesper. "I've a string at my throat, with a wolfsbane bead on it, and juniper resin, and something else that I'd want my glasses for." She prodded him with the stick. "I'm 81 years old, boy. I laid out corpses in this quarter for 40 of them. I know a scent mask when it's under my nose." Nessa looked between them. "A what?" "A mask." Hesper did not take her eyes off him. "Wolves smell rank the way you and I see color. Alpha, beta, omega, sick, breeding, frightened, lying. It's all just there for them, written on the air. A mask closes it. Costs more than this quarter earns in a year, and there's 4 apothecaries in Kaldemir licensed to make one." She sniffed. 2 kinds of man wear one, a man hiding from his enemies. "And," said Nessa, "and a man hiding from his friends." The beggar sat up slowly and rubbed his face and said, "I've enemies." "I don't doubt it," said Hesper Column. She turned and stumped back toward the door, and at the threshold she stopped and added, without turning round, "There's a 3rd kind, mind. Comes round every 9 years or so. But he'd be a fool to come up Kiln Row, so it isn't that." The door shut behind her. Nessa looked at the beggar. The beggar looked at the fire. "What's the 3rd kind?" she said. "Superstition." "What's the 3rd kind?" "You've no flour," he said. "And it's past the 7th bell." Ferris Otway kept the last independent mill in the lower valley, a squat wheelhouse on the silt where the river ran brown, and he was dying, and everybody, including Ferris, knew it. He met her at the tail race with a rag at his mouth. He was 50 and looked 70. When he took the rag away, it was spotted. "You're mad coming here," he said. "There's a Concord man on the bridge 4 days a week. Today he's at his sister's wedding, which is why you're standing there instead of in a cell." Ferris Otway looked past her at the big ragged figure who had walked the 4 miles from the city without a word, and now stood at the water's edge like a stone somebody had left. "And who's that?" "He carries. He looks like he could carry the mill." She got 2 sacks of clean rye out of Ferris Otway that morning, on the promise of a copper a week for 9 weeks, and the certainty that neither of them would live long enough to see the debt closed properly. And she got one thing more, which she had not come for. "Sit," Ferris said when the sacks were tied. "You'll want to hear this, and I'll want to have said it before I can't." He sat on the millstone dressing bench with his hands on his knees, and the wheel turned behind him, and he told her about the sweep. "Every mill in the valley," he said, "sends its floor sweep to the grain hold, always did. Sweeps the stuff off the floor, dust, husk, mouse dirt, the bad grain you've picked out. Used to be it went to pigmen, copper a cartload, nobody thought about it. And now? Now it goes into the poor flour." Nessa said nothing. 4 years back, the Concord bought the Eastern Harvest forward, Ferris said. Whole Eastern Harvest standing in the field on paper at a fixed price. Then it rained for 6 weeks and the rye came in with the spur in it. You know the spur? Silver spur, the black grains. Then you know more than the Concord's own physicers claim to. He coughed and waited it out. Spur-sick rye's not fit for a dog. In my father's day, the reeve came with a torch and burned the rick where it stood, and the crown paid the farmer half. That's the old law, the assay. Grain gets looked at by a warden who doesn't answer to the buyer, and if it's spurred, it burns. So burn it. They can't afford to. Ferris Otway smiled with no teeth in it. That's the whole of it, girl. That's the whole rotten heart of the whole rotten thing. They bought 4 years of harvest forward on borrowed money, and if they burn what they bought, they can't pay what they borrowed. And if they can't pay what they borrowed, the Concord goes under and takes 11 noble houses with it. So they don't burn it. They blend it. 2 parts sound to 1 part spur, ground fine, whitened with chalk and bone so you can't see the specks, stamped with the Concord seal, and sold at 14 coppers to the only people in Kaldemir who can't say no. The river turned the wheel. The wheel turned the stone. Not to the high quarters, Nessa said. Her voice came out strange. Course not. Vintner's Hill eats white wheat from the marches. They're not fools. They just needed somewhere for it to go. He looked at his own spotted rag. And there's 90,000 souls in the low quarters of this city, and every one of them has to eat every day, and none of them has a physician who'll write down what they died of. Nessa thought of a 9-year-old asleep with his fist against his mouth. She thought of the mill widows of Tanner's Stair. She thought of her mother spreading pale flour thin on a dark board by the window, and finding 1 black grain in it, and going very still. "Ferris," she said, "who signs it?" The assay warden signed it. Or they'd have to. "Then find me a warden." "That," said Ferris Otway, "is the joke." He got up off the bench. "There's no wardens, girl. There hasn't been an independent assay in this kingdom for 20 years. The office was folded into the Concord the year the old king died. Economy measure, they called it. And the warden's rolls. Every assay for 400 years. The whole record of whoever put what in a sack went into the grain-hold vaults and burned in a fire nobody investigated." He shrugged. "The Concord assays itself now, marks its own homework. And the last chief warden of the hearths, who screamed about it loud enough that people heard, died in the fire with her rolls. Behind Nessa, the big ragged figure at the water's edge had gone entirely still. "What was her name?" Nessa said. Ferris Otway rubbed his jaw. "Ardell," he said. "Same as yours, funnily enough. It's a common enough name in the—" He stopped. He looked at her properly for the first time in 9 years of copper a week. "Oh," said Ferris Otway. "Oh, girl." They walked the 4 miles back with a sack each, and did not speak for the first 3 of them. "You knew," Nessa said at last. "I suspected." "Since when?" "Since you told me your name in the rain." She stopped in the middle of the road. He walked 3 steps further, and stopped 2, and stood with 100 weight of rye across his shoulders as though it were a folded coat. "My mother," she said. Washed linen. She washed linen on Kiln Row for 11 years, and she was so tired at night she'd fall asleep with her hands in her lap, and I'd have to walk her to her bed. Yes. She knew 4 alphabets. Yes. She had a stone. Yes, said the beggar. She had a stone. The road ran empty in both directions. Away west, Kaldemir sat on its 7 hills under a lid of coal smoke, and above the smoke the hollow mount rose black and terraced. And on the highest terrace the fortress of the Aldemar kings caught what sun there was and threw it back like a struck coin. Say the rest of it, Nessa said. I can't. Not yet. Can't or can't. Something raw came up under the word. Nessa. If I say the rest of it today, you are dead inside a week, and the boy with you, and the old woman with the stick, and the miller, and every name any of you speaks between now and then. There is one way this ends with you standing up, and it is not fast, and I am asking you to give me 9 days. Why 9? Because that's what I have. She stared at him, the beard, the ruin, the cloak that had been good wool once. Who are you? A man who has been asking the wrong question for a long time, he said. In the wrong places, of the wrong people, and got the right answer this morning from a miller who's dying. He shifted the sack. Bake tomorrow, bake clean, sell where they can see you, and when they come for you, and they will come, because a girl who bakes clean bread in the Ember Quarter is now the most dangerous object in this city. You say nothing except what is true. That's your protection? Tell the truth? It's the only kind that doesn't need me alive, said the beggar, and walked on. They came for her 3 days later, and they did not come for her. Nessa was at the oven with her arms in flour to the elbow when the knock landed. Not a fist, a formal stave, 3 strokes, the sound of the law. She opened the door, and there was Garrick Dunmore, and beside him a Concord clerk with a writ case, and behind them 4 men. Nessa Ardell of Kiln Row, the clerk read. Debt of valuation upon 1 cart, seized lawful, unredeemed at the 8th day. Sum of 9 crowns 4. I'll pay the debt secured against household goods and household persons under the Concord Bond Act. The clerk did not look up. Household goods insufficient. Surety, therefore, taken in person. The world went very slow and very quiet. No, Nessa said. Dunmore would not look at her. That was how she knew. The grainhold workhouse keeps him fed, the clerk said, and schooled, and he works off the bond at a copper the day, and at 9 crowns 4, that is. He's 9 years old. He has mill rot. He can't. 2,240 days, said the clerk, and closed the case. And Tobin Ardell, who had come to the door behind his sister with flour on his hands because he had been shaping rolls, looked up at her with their mother's stubborn chin and said, in a very small and very steady voice, Nessa, it's all right. Don't fight them. Don't fight them, Nessa. They took him down Kiln Row in the rain. And from the dry corner where the salt shed met the ward wall, a ruined man with a wooden bowl watched them go, and then stood, and reached up, and broke the string at his throat. Later, the Ember Quarter would argue for years about what happened on Kiln Row at the 11th bell, and no 2 accounts would agree, and all of them would be true. What Corwith the tanner said, that the rain changed direction. What the Fenimore sisters said, that every dog in the quarter lay down flat in the mud at the same moment, all the way down to the fish stalls, and did not get up for a count of 40. What Widow Hesper Column said, sitting very upright in her chair with her stick across her knees. I've smelled 3 kings in my life, and I've never smelled one angry. What Nessa Ardell felt was simpler than any of it. She was standing in the middle of the lane where they had taken her brother, and her legs had stopped holding her, and she was on her knees in the black water with her hands flat in it. And then something came down the hill behind her like weather. It went through her chest. It went through her spine. It was not a smell, and it was not a sound. It was the sensation of a door opening in a house she had lived in all her life and never once noticed had a wall in that place. Wood smoke, iron, cold stone after rain, and underneath it something that had no name in any language she owned, that reached into the middle of her and pulled, and every hair on her body rose at once, and her wolf, the small, starved, unremarkable wolf that had lain quiet in her since she was 15, that had never once been worth mentioning to anybody, sat up in her ribs and howled. Nessa turned her head. The beggar was walking down Kiln Row. He had the broken string in his fist. He was not hurrying. Around him the neighbors were going down, not kneeling, going down the way grass goes down under a hand. Corwith and the Fenimores and the boy with the hinge, and the 14 people who had come out to see a child taken, dropping one after another into the mud with their heads bowed and their throats bared, and their faces slack with a terror that had a great deal of joy mixed into it. He stopped in front of her. "Get up," he said. "I can't. Nessa." His voice cracked straight down the middle. "Get up. Not to me. Never to me. Get up." She got up, and the rain washed the filth off a face she had looked at for 4 days without ever once seeing it, and the eyes that came up to meet hers were gold, molten and depthless and old. And Nessa Ardell knew, with the whole weight of her body and none of her mind at all, exactly what she was standing in front of. 9 nights, she said. Her lips were numb. The Ember Walk, Hesper's third kind. Yes. Every 9 years the Alpha King goes down into his own city in rags, she said, reciting it the way you recite a children's rhyme, and takes nothing and asks nothing and sees who feeds him. And then he chooses a Luna at the rite. She laughed. Came out wrong. It's a story. It's a thing grandmothers say. It's a law, said Severin Aldemar, Alpha King of Hallomere, 1100 years old, and it is the only one of my family's laws I have ever had any use for. You let them whip me. I did. You watched. I watched, he said, because the walk forbids me to lift a hand, and because I have been walking it 8 nights, and in 8 nights I had seen 400 citizens of my city look at a starving man and step around him. And on the 9th morning a girl with a whip cut across her hand broke her last loaf in half. Then stop them. She was screaming. She heard herself screaming at the Alpha King in the middle of Kiln Row and could not stop. They have my brother. I know. Then stop them. I cannot, said the king. And that is the thing I have come down this hill to tell you, and you are going to want to sit down for it. The house smelled of bread, because the loaves were still in the oven, and nobody had thought to draw them. He sat on her 3-legged stool, which put his knees somewhere near his chest, and he did not once look comfortable, and Nessa afterward would think that this was the moment she stopped being frightened of him, that he sat on a bad stool in a wet kitchen and let it be undignified. The Concord holds a charter, he said. It was granted in my great-grandfather's reign, and it is written like a snare. The crown may not seize conquered property, may not open conquered books, may not overturn a lawful conquered bond, except upon a finding of the assay of hearths. There is no assay of hearths. There is no assay of hearths, Severin agreed. It was dissolved 20 years ago. By who? He was quiet for a moment. By my father, he said. Signed with the Aldemar seal in the last winter of his life, when he could not hold a spoon and Bertrand Kessel could hold a pen. And I have spent 9 years of my reign trying to prove that my own house's seal was set to a fraud, because until I prove it, that charter stands, and while that charter stands, I am a king who can raise an army and cannot open a granary. Nessa sat down on the hearthstone. You wanted the stone. I wanted the warden, he said. Nessa Ardell was chief warden of the hearths. She refused the dissolution 3 times in writing. On the night the vault burned, she went into it and came out again. And after that, There was no Nessa Ardell anywhere in Hallomere, and Kessel has had men looking for her for 20 years, and so for 9 have I. I found the trail 4 months ago. A washerwoman on Kiln Row who died of a fever 2 winters back and left 2 children and an oven. So you came here. I came for you, he said. That is the ugly part, and you'll have it whole. I did not stumble down your lane. Corin Haskey had your name before I ever put the mask on. I chose to walk the Ember Walk in the Ember Quarter, because the Ember Quarter is where the last Warden's daughter was. And I told myself it was 2 duties in 1 journey, and I have been sick with it since the morning of the whip. Nessa looked at her hands. Then it wasn't a test, she said. You knew what I'd do. No. He leaned forward. No. Nessa, I knew where you lived. I knew nothing else. I had a name on a list, and I had a chancellor who wants that name in the ground. And everything I have seen of you since. Every single thing. You did without knowing there was a king in the corner. Something moved in his throat. You broke the loaf before you knew. That is the only reason any of this is bearable. And there it was again. That pull, low and enormous. The thing that had come down the hill and gone through her spine. He felt it too. She could see him refusing to name it. It's the bond, she said. Yes. I'm barely a wolf. I've never even... You are a warden's daughter of the old line, Severin said. The hearth line ran quiet on purpose. They were the only wolves in the kingdom permitted to say no to a king. And the only way to survive 4 centuries of that is to smell like nobody at all. He almost smiled. Your mother must have been magnificent. She washed linen, Nessa said, and started to cry, and hated herself, and did not stop. They came for the stone at dawn. Not Dunmore this time. 20 men in conquered grey with a grain court order and a cart, and at their head, on a black mare, a woman in a riding cloak the color of dried blood. Nessa had seen Lady Isabel Kessel before, the way the low quarters see the high, as a shape going past behind glass. Close, she was younger than the stories, 24 or 5, with her father's long jaw and none of his ease. The stone, she said, by order of the grain court, upon suspicion of forged assay marks. Stand aside. It's my oven floor. Then you'll bake on brick. Isabel's voice was flat and quick. Girl, there are 20 men behind me, and they have been told what to do if you put a hand on it. Stand aside. They took it out with iron bars, and the oven mouth gaped behind it like a pulled tooth. And Nessa stood in her doorway with her fists closed and did nothing, because Severin Aldemar had gone up the hollow mount in the night and had told her one thing before he went. Whatever they take, let them take it. The only thing I cannot save is a corpse. At the cart, Isabel Kessel turned in the saddle. She looked at the scorch on the doorframe. She looked at the 14 neighbors in the lane. She looked at Nessa for a long moment, and her mouth did something complicated. Your brother is in the Grainhold house, she said. 3rd dormitory. He has a bed by the window because I moved him there yesterday. He has had the physician's syrup twice. A pause. Do not thank me. It is not kindness. It is bookkeeping. And she rode away, and Nessa stood in the rain and understood that she had just been given something, and could not for the life of her work out what. The Hollow Mount Council chamber ran 100 feet long, and every man in it wanted her dead by a different method. Deny her, said the Lord Marshal. The Ember Walk is a private observance. Your Majesty was never in that quarter, and the girl is a lunatic with a stone. Marry her quietly and send her north, said the Master of Coin. The Concord's paper is in every vault in the kingdom, including this one. If it falls, the crown falls 11 days later. Hang her with Kessel's rope and grieve publicly, said an old duke by the fire, who at least had the honesty to say it plainly. A dead witness is a martyr for 1 season. A live one is a war. Severin Aldemar stood at the window with his back to all of them, and looked down through the smoke at a hill of soot-black lanes. 9 years he had been king, and every day of it, he had told himself the same thing. Not yet, when I am stronger, when the paper is safer, when the ledgers come to hand. And in the 9 years of not yet, a woman named Nessa Ardell had washed linen until her hands cracked, and 8 children had gone into the ground off Tanner's Stair, and a boy in his city had begun to cough. "My lords," he said, turning, "hear the whole of it, because none of you have. The assay is not dead law, it is sleeping law. And the charter that binds my hands is the same charter that binds the concords. They may not be seized and they may not be closed to a warden, and for 20 years there has been no warden to close them to." He came down the length of the table. "There is one now. There is exactly one living person in Hallomere of the Hearthline, and Bertrand Kessel has just carried the other half of her evidence into his own court on a cart, under a cloth, thinking it was a slum baking stone." "You let him take it," said the master of coin. "I let him put it on the record," said the king. "You cannot enter a stone into a grain court after the fact, my lord. But you can certainly cut one open in front of 400 witnesses, if you are arrogant enough to think there is nothing inside." He set his hands on the table. "And now you will all hear the part you will like least. The dissolution order bears my father's seal. Whatever we prove about the conquered, we prove about this house at the same hour, and I will not have it managed, softened, or held back for a better season. There will not be a better season. There has never once in 1100 years been a better season." The chamber was silent. "And if the court takes her stone and hangs her anyway," said the old duke by the fire, "and calls the marks a forgery?" "Then I will have brought a girl from Kiln Row to a rope," said Severin Aldemar, "and I will live in that for the rest of my life, and so will every one of you." He straightened. "Which is why the finding must be hers, not mine. If a king says the grain is poisoned, it is politics, and in 20 years, another king says otherwise. If a warden says it, in open court, on the old law, with the evidence read out where the whole city can hear, then it is a fact, my lords, and facts outlast us. My father learned that the hard way. He put his seal on one, and it waited 20 years in the floor of an oven. Nessa spent the night before the trial on the hearthstone of an oven with nothing in its mouth. Hesper Column sat with her, because Hesper Column had decided the matter was settled and had not asked. "You'll want to say it clever," the old woman said, around midnight. "Don't. They'll have 11 advocates and a hall built to make you feel small. That's what a ceiling that high is for, girl." Hesper poked the fire. "You've stood behind a cart since you were 15. That's all a court is. A very expensive market where they're haggling over your neck." Nessa looked at the black hole where the stone had been. "He's the king," she said. "He is. He sat on my stool. He did that too." Hesper. Her voice came apart. "If I stand up in that court and lose, my brother stays in that house. If I sit down and take the bond and beg, they'll give him back in 11 years with a Concord mark on his hand and he'll be alive." She pressed her fist into her eyes. "Alive is not nothing. Tell me alive is not nothing." The old woman was quiet for a while. "I had 2 boys," she said at last. "Both went into the Tanner's Stair mills at 11. Both came out on the Wednesday cart before they were 30. And every night for 40 years I have lain in my bed and thought, I knew something, and I could have said it, and instead, I kept them fed for a season." She set the poker down. "Alive is not nothing, Nessa. It is just a great deal less than they tell you it is when they're the ones deciding how long." The grain court sat in the great vaulted hall of the grain hold, under 400 years of stone sacks carved into the corbels, and it sat in judgment on Nessa Ardell of Kiln Row on the 3rd day after. The charges took 11 minutes to read. Sale of unassayed grain, evasion of Concord stamp, debt default, forgery of a warden's mark upon a stone, which carried the lash, possession of seditious record, which carried the mines, and last, treason against the peace of the realm, in that the accused did conspire to bring the Aldemar crown into contempt by false accusation against the grain of the kingdom. Which carried the rope. Chancellor Bertrand Kessel rose to speak, and Nessa saw for the first time the man at the bottom of all of it. He was not a monster. That was somehow the worst part. He was 60, neat, mild, with reading glasses pushed up into thin gray hair, and the tired courtesy of a man who has done a hard job for a long time and been thanked for it insufficiently. When he spoke like an accountant, explaining a shortfall to a room of decent people. 11 noble houses stand behind the Concord's paper, he said. 41,000 men are employed in its mills and barges. The Concord fed this city through the wet years when the crown's granaries stood empty, and it did so on borrowed money, and I will not apologize for the borrowing. He took off his glasses and polished them. Every kingdom is a promise about next year's bread. Break the promise and you do not get justice. You get a mob, and a mob does not distribute grain. It burns granaries. He put the glasses back on. This girl says the flour is poisoned, said quietly, in the proper offices, that could be managed, over 4 seasons without panic. She has chosen to say it in a market square. He looked at her, almost with sympathy. You will have your justice, and 90,000 people will have their famine, and you will not live long enough to be blamed for it. That is the arithmetic. I have done it every year for 20 years, and I have slept. Have you? Said Nessa. The hall went quiet. Have you slept? She said again. Since Tanner's Stair? There were 9 funerals on Tanner's Stair the summer before last, and 8 of them were children, and I baked the bread for the wakes, my Lord Chancellor, all 8, and I have watched a 9-year-old boy cough up his own chest lining in the room where I sleep. So you tell this court your arithmetic, and I will tell it my subtraction, and we shall see which one this city recognizes. Kessel's face did not change. The stone, he said. They brought it in on a cart, under a cloth, and set it in the well of the court. The accused claims this object is a record of assay. It is a baking stone from a slum oven, marked with scratches. In 1 hour the court's masons will cut it in half, and the court will see for itself that there is nothing inside it but 400 years of soot. He nodded to the clerk. Before that, the Crown's own case requires corroboration of the accused's character and conduct. I call one witness. My lord, said the clerk, the witness is a minor child. The witness, said Bertrand Kessel, is her brother. And the doors at the back of the grain court opened, and they brought Tobin Ardell down the long aisle in a grain-hold smock 2 sizes too large, with a bruise under one eye and his mouth pressed into their mother's stubborn line, and he did not look at his sister once, because he had been told exactly what would happen to her if he did. They put Tobin Ardell on a stool in the well of the grain court, and his feet did not reach the floor. You are 9, said the Chancellor's advocate. Yes, sir. You live with your sister. I did, sir. I live at the grain-hold now. And your sister bakes bread and sells it in Ember Market without the Concord stamp. Yes, sir. Speak up, boy. Yes, sir, said Tobin, and coughed, and the sound of it went up into the vaulting and came back down over 400 people, and something in the hall shifted very slightly, the way a heavy cart shifts on a hill before it begins to move. The advocate smiled. And has she ever told you that the Concord's flour is poisoned? Yes, sir. Did she tell you to say so to other people? No, sir. She told me never to say it to anyone. Tobin's chin came up. She said the last people who said it are in the ground. So she knew it was a lie. No, sir. She knew it was true. That will do. You ask me what I know, said Tobin Ardell, and his voice went thin and high and absolutely clear. And I know the 3rd dormitory. There's 41 of us. We get gray bread twice and gray porridge once, and the porridge has bits in it like little black claws. And if you pick them out, the wardens hit you for wasting. Ansel Crow in the bed under mine coughs blood. Maddie Fenn stopped being able to feel her feet in the spring, and she's 11 and she can't walk right now, and they say she's lazy. There's a cart comes Wednesdays for the ones who... Enough. For the ones who stop, said Tobin. And it goes out the back, sir, so the barge men can't see it. And I counted 6 Wednesdays, and I counted the cart every time. And my sister taught me to count with dough weights, and I counted. The grain court of Kaldemir made no sound at all. Bertrand Kessel rose slowly. The boy is coached, he said, by the accused, and by whatever hand is behind her. There is no hand behind her, said Nessa. There is always a hand. Kessel turned to the bench. My lords, this is a girl from Kiln Row with a whip cut and a grievance. She has not the letters to read Old Hallow, nor the wit to invent a Warden stone. Somebody is using her, somebody who wants the conquered broken, and has found a poor pretty face to break it with. And I ask this court to consider who profits, and to consider that this court's own funding passes through the Concord's clearinghouse on the... I profit, said a voice from the back of the hall. The doors stood open. Severin Aldemar came down the aisle of the grain court, in the black and iron gray of his house, shaved, crowned, with Corin Hask at his shoulder, and 40 of the king's own filling the doorway behind him, and the whole hall went down like grass under a hand. Nessa did not go down. Nessa could not have moved if the roof had come in. Your Majesty, said Kessel, bowing, entirely composed. The crown has no standing in a conquered matter. The charter of... I have read the charter, said the king. I have read it 1,100 times. The crown may not seize, may not open, may not overturn, except upon a finding of the assay of hearths. He stopped in the well of the court, beside a 9-year-old on a stool. Chancellor, I am not here to overturn you. I am here to give evidence. Evidence. I am the witness to the character and conduct of the accused. Severin turned to the bench. For 4 days of the Ember Walk I sat against the salt-shed wall in Ember Market under a beggar's mask, as 1,100 years of law provides. I record for this court that 406 citizens of Kaldemir passed me. I record that 11 gave me something. I record that on the 9th morning, I watched Captain Garrick Dunmore of the Concord destroy 9 loaves of clean bread belonging to Nessa Ardell, and open her hand with a whip, and that she picked half a ruined loaf out of the mud and gave it to me. A muscle moved in his jaw. She did not know me. There is no coaching in that, my Lord Chancellor. There is no hand behind that. There is only what a person is when nobody who matters is watching. A touching account, said Kessel. It is not an assay. No, Severin agreed. That comes next. Captain Dunmore, stand up. Garrick Dunmore stood up in the 4th row, like a man pulled by a hook. Captain, I will ask you plainly, in front of your city, said the king. And you will remember that I can smell a lie in this hall from here. Where does the sweep go? Dunmore's yellow eyes went round the room. He looked at Kessel. He looked at the boy on the stool. He looked at the whip-cut hand of the girl in the dock. Grinding house 4, he said hoarsely. 2 carts a night, out of the west gate at the 3rd bell so the bargemen don't see. It goes in the poor flour at 1 part in 3, and they whiten it with bone and chalk out of the tannery. And I've signed for it 1,100 times. And my own mother's on Tanner's Stair, and I've been buying her white wheat from the marches for 2 years out of my own purse, and telling her it fell off a barge. He sat down and put his face in his hands. It proves nothing, said Bertrand Kessel. He had not moved. 1 frightened captain. 1 rumor. Grain spoils. Sweep is sold. The world is dirty. Cut the stone. Yes, said the king. Cut the stone. 2 masons came forward with saws and wedges, and Nessa heard herself make a small sound and stopped it. Wait. Isabel Kessel had risen from the chancellor's own bench. My lords, before it is cut, I have a matter for the court. Sit down, said her father. The Kessel charity hearths feed 410 children daily in the lower quarters. I founded them. I ran them. I was very proud of them." Her voice was doing something dreadful and staying steady anyway. "We fed them conquered poor flour, at cost, from my father's warehouses, and I thanked him for it in a public letter this court will find in its own records. In 3 years I have buried 11 of those children, and I have never once been able to make the numbers agree. So I began, as my father taught me, to keep a private book." She lifted a ledger. "This is the grain-hold shrinkage book, my lords. The real one. Every warehouse in the kingdom keeps 2. The assayed weight and the shrinkage. Sound grain shrinks 2 parts in 100. Grinding house 4 has been shrinking 29. She set it on the clerk's table. You cannot lose 29 parts in 100, my lords. You can only move them. Isabel." Kessel's mildness had gone. "You will stop." "I fed them," said his daughter. "I did, with my own hands, out of my own charity, in my own name. And they thanked me. And I have to live in this city afterward, father. And I find that I cannot." She sat down and looked at nothing. "Cut the stone." The saws went in. It took 19 minutes, and the sound of it went through Nessa's teeth, and when it was done the 2 masons stood back and the hall craned forward, and there was nothing inside the stone. Nothing at all. Gray rock, 400 years of soot in the skin of it, and a clean dead face where the saw had passed. Bertrand Kessel let out a breath and permitted himself at last a small tired smile. "There," he said. "Now hang her." "Read the edge," said Severin Aldemar. Kessel stopped. "The old assay was a split tally," said the king. "It was designed by people who assumed everyone above them was a thief, which is the only sound basis for an accounting system. A warden did not keep a record. A warden kept half a record. The marks were cut across 2 stones at once, and no forger alive can fake one, because he would need the other." He turned and looked up at the great weighing floor of the grain hold, where the scales hung on their chains above the granite dais. "Chancellor," said the king, "what is that dais made of?" Bertrand Kessel did not answer. "It is the warden's bench," said Severin. "It has been the warden's bench since the reign of Halvard III, and it is 19 tons of hollow mount granite. And when you dissolved the assay, you did not tear it up, because it holds the scales, and because nobody in 400 years has looked at the front rim." He nodded to his beta. "Corin, sweep it." They brought lamps and a horsehair brush, and Corin Hask went down on one knee before the great dais and swept 400 years of flour dust out of a band of small angular scratches running the length of its face. And they carried the half of a slum baking stone across the floor of the grain court and set it against the granite, and the marks ran on. They ran on across the join without a stumble. The same hand, the same depth, the same little upward hook at the end of every 7th stroke. A woman's careful private handwriting continuing across 19 tons of stone she had never been able to take with her. Somebody at the back of the hall began, very quietly, to weep. "Autumn quarter, year of the wet harvest," read the King of Hallomere, tracing it with 2 fingers. "Eastern rye, 41,000 bushels. Assay, spurred, 1 part in 3. Warden's finding. Condemn and burn entire. By the old law, no appeal." He looked up. "And here, cut smaller, at the end of the run, because she was running out of stone and out of time. Refused 3 times by the chancellor of the grainhold. Refused a 4th. Signed over my finding in my own name. Forged. I am carving this because paper burns, and I will not." He stood. "Nessa Ardell, chief warden of the hearths," said Severin Aldemar, "gave her finding to this kingdom on the 9th of Frostmoon 20 years ago, and this kingdom answered her with a fire. She spent the rest of her life washing linen on a hill so that her daughter could grow up to be nobody, and she put the last honest assay in Hallomere in the floor of an oven, and it has been baking bread for the poor of the Ember Quarter every morning for 20 years. His voice did not rise and did not need to. My lords, the assay of hearths has spoken. The finding stands. It has always stood. There is a version of the story where the Alpha King tears out Bertrand Kessel's throat on the floor of the grain court. It is the version the ballads prefer. It is not what happened, and Nessa Ardell spent the rest of her life correcting people about it. What happened was that the king sat down in the witness chair like any other man giving evidence, and said, "One further matter. The dissolution of the assay bears the Aldemar seal. My father's hand was on it. I do not know whether he understood what he was sealing, and I have decided that it does not signify, because a crown that only answers for the crimes it intended is not a crown. It is a boy's excuse. The crown submits itself to the finding." And then he named her. By the charter, only a warden of the hearths may hold an assay open. The office is vacant. He looked across the well of the court at a girl in a flower-stained dress with a whip cut across her palm. Nessa Ardell of Kiln Row, of the Hearth line, daughter of Ilsa. Will you take it? She thought of her mother's hands falling asleep in her lap. What does it mean? She said. It means you may say no to me, said the king, in front of anyone, forever, and I may do nothing about it. Then yes, said Nessa Ardell. The trials took 4 months. Bertrand Kessel was not hanged. He was attainted before the restored assay of hearths, in open court, with the shrinkage books read aloud in full. 11 days of reading, every warehouse, every barge, every ton, and his defense was heard at every stage and lost at every stage. And Nessa insisted on that, and Severin, who wanted very much to do it faster, let her have it. He died in the Hallomere prison 11 years later, still writing letters about arithmetic. The Concord was not burned. It was opened, broken into 11 public hearths, 1 to each quarter, each with a granary and a mill and a stamp, each assayed 4 times a year by wardens who could not be dismissed by the men whose grain they weighed. 41,000 mill workers kept their work. The famine Kessel had promised did not come, because the king emptied the Hallomount's war granaries into the low quarters through a winter people still talk about, and because a city will forgive a great deal from anyone who tells it the truth first. The Bond Act was repealed in a single afternoon. They called the repealing statute the Loaf Law, because the Ember Quarter had already started calling it that, and nobody in the Chancery could make a better name stick. No person in Hallomere may be taken as surety for a debt. Not a child. Not for 9 crowns for. Not for anything. Isabel Kessel gave evidence against her father for 9 of the 11 days, and never once asked mercy for herself. The assay found her negligent and not complicit. She asked to be sentenced anyway, was refused, and so sentenced herself. She turned the returned Kessel lands into the physic houses on Tanner's Stair. She and Nessa never became friends. They served on the same board for 30 years, and neither of them ever missed a meeting. Garrick Dunmore served 4 years in the Hallomount quarries, and when he came out, Nessa gave him a job hauling flour, and half the Ember Quarter stopped speaking to her for a season over it, and she let them. Mattie Fenn walked again by midsummer. Ansel Crow did not live to see the spring, and Tobin Ardell, who had counted 6 Wednesdays, was carried out of the Grainhold workhouse on the shoulders of the king's own beta, while 401 other children walked out behind him into a rain that everybody afterward swore had stopped. The physicians of the Hallomount could do nothing for mill rot, which they had spent 20 years calling damp. Clean bread could. Clean bread, and Isabel Kessel's physic house, and 3 years of stubbornness. And at 19, Tobin Ardell was a tall boy, with a permanent rasp in his voice, and a winter cough that never again came back the way it had. And he became, to his sister's undisguised disgust, an accountant. You could be anything, she said. I know, said Tobin. I like counting things. The Lunarite came in the spring, and Nessa Ardell refused it. Not the man, the right. It's a market, she said, They were on the terrace above the smoke, and Kaldemir lay below them with its 7 hills going gold. 200 girls in white in a hall, and a king walks down the line. I've stood behind a cart. I know a market when I'm being sold at one. It is 1100 years old. So is the Ember Walk, and that one's good. She turned. You want me in that line? No, said Severin. I never did. I want you to end it. So she ended it, a finding of 11 words in her 2nd year of office, no objection entered by the Crown, and a chancery forced to invent an entirely new form of marriage contract in 8 days, which they resented for a generation. They were married in Ember Market, not in the Hollow Mount. In the square, between the fish stalls and the salt sheds, with the whole quarter in it, and widow Hesper Column, 84 and furious about the seating, in the front row, with her stick across her knees. Nessa wore a dress the color of good rye. Severin stood in front of the salt shed wall, in the dry corner where a beggar had once kept a wooden bowl with nothing in it, and when the bond closed, the dogs of the Ember quarter lay down flat in the mud from the well all the way to the fish stalls, and did not get up for a count of 40. She never gave up the oven, and the court never understood it. The Luna of Hallomere, chief warden of the hearths, walked down the Hollow Mount 3 mornings a week to bake in a 2-room house on Kiln Row. And the 2nd warden's bench of the kingdom was a repaired slum bakestone, sawn in half and clamped back together in an iron cradle, in the mouth of a chimney her great-grandmother built out of river clay. She baked on her mother's evidence for another 40 years. The last of it is this. On a wet gray morning in the 11th year, Nessa came down to the oven before dawn and found a man in the lane outside her window. Filthy. Layered filthy, the way a man is filthy when he has been so through several seasons. A wooden bowl by his knee with nothing in it. She stood at the shutter with her hands in flour and looked at him for a long moment. Then she took a loaf from the morning's first draw, dark as riverbank soil, and broke it in half and went out into the rain. He looked up. His eyes were brown and tired and entirely ordinary, and he was nobody at all. No king, no test, no golden hour waiting behind the beard. Just a man in a lane with a bowl. She gave him the bread anyway. There's a hearth on Tanner's Stair, she said, and they'll not ask your name. 2nd turning past the physic house. Say the baker sent you. He took it in both hands and could not speak, and she went back inside, because the 2nd draw was coming up, and the oven does not wait for anyone, not even for the woman who ended the rite. Her mother had told her once, bread that is not given is only flour. She had thought, for a long time afterward, that the whole thing had been a test, that a king had come down a hill in rags and weighed her heart and found it good, and that everything she had was the prize. She was wrong, and it took her 30 years to see it. And this is what she saw. There had never been a test. There had only been a hungry man against a wall, and 200 people in a market who looked away, and one who did not. The king was an accident. So the question she left, carved on the front rim of the 2nd warden's bench, in the hard hand of Old Hallow, where the loaves would rub it smooth over the next 400 years, was not who was the beggar. It was this: if nobody is watching, and nobody will ever know, what will you do with the last half of your bread?